Hey, my name is Gleb Alexandrov and we carry on talking about cinematic lighting. In this tutorial we will extend our comfort zone and our interest in the cinematic lighting formula all the way to post-processing. This part of the process, often overlooked, is all about bringing out the best lighting qualities of your setup, of your formula. We will do that by building a versatile post-processing chain in the Blender Compositor, a cinematic post-processing formula with enhancements and color grading options if you wish. We will go through every building block of that formula together, starting with a glare effect and then moving on and on and on through the post-processing chain to ultimately pack it all into its own group so it can be imported to other blend files to quickly post-pro anything you want. So that is our plan, to shape the image in such a way to squeeze most of our lighting setup that we have created in the previous tutorial. So grab the project file and some coffee and let's go. Before starting to explore the post-processing chain, it is important to draw the distinction between the scene-referred and display-referred formats. So imagine you have just rendered your shiny new lighting setup in Blender, and what you see on screen actually has two layers to it. A deeper layer that we cannot see directly on our screens is the data of our render engine of cycles. The unbounded light intensity is stored in the 32-bit format. And then the second layer is what gets transferred to our display, what we actually see on screen. That is called a display-referred image. To better get the difference between these two types of image and how it all ties with the post-processing chain, let's first save our image as PNG or JPEG or any other 8-bit format, with 8-bit holding a display-referred data in this case. So let's go with any 8-bit format, like JPEG, PNG, TIFF. By saving the image in one of these formats, we will effectively bake the color management within the image pixels. It will be the death of the deeper data layer, the layer that held all the high dynamic range intensities of light in your scene. Actually, it's pretty easy to prove that there is some range of intensities underneath what is displayed. Let's open our color management tab to get access to exposure slider. It will come in handy in just a moment. Now, if we sample the hottest spot in our render, probably generated by the sun lamp, via right-clicking on it, you will see that there are intensities there that go well beyond 1. For example, the red channel is as bright as 35 units. And these units are not the display brightnesses that go from black to white. These values are the unbounded brightnesses of the actual 3D scene. Technically, it can go from 0 all the way to infinity and beyond, while our miserable Rec 709 displays are limited to go from 0 to 1 in terms of intensity, and that's it. Now watch the hotspot. It's a really hot bunch of pixels indeed. Now if we start killing the exposure, notice that the hotspot is still hot. Why is it so? Because it had the higher intensities right off the start. The intensity that we have sampled before, and if we sample it now, it won't change. The red channel will still peak around 35 to 40 units, depending on where you sample it. So even after the reduction of the exposure in the color management tab, these super bright scene referred light values still result in super bright pixels on display after it gets transferred to our display via the color management system. The CM letters here stand for color managed. So that's why this part doesn't want to get dimmed, even when we reduce the exposure, because it holds an enormous punch in the scene referred realm. Alright, so what would be the right way to save the entire dynamic range of this image then? There is a special type of image formats meant for storing such data, the scene-referred data. Glorious OpenEXR, for example. This format can store 32-bit data with floating point accuracy, or half floating point accuracy if you want to save on the file size. It has a bunch of very potent compression codecs that we won't go into right now. But the main thing about it, let's keep it short, is that it can save the whole range of the scene-referred unbounded image data, or light data in other words. And you guessed it, we will need this 32-bit image fidelity in post-processing if we're gonna save the file just like we did and post-process it afterwards. To drive it home, let's compare 8-bit display-referred and 32-bit scene-referred formats in Blender Compositor and see how it all works. So I'm gonna open the new blend file, toggle the compositor right away, and to remove the right tool shelf, check use nodes. What else? Maybe for convenience's sake, I'll create two windows. The bottom one will be the image editor, where we will preview our compositing chain. Now, the resolution should be set to 1920 by 1080 pixels, just like our original scene. It's the best practice to make sure these two things align perfectly. Now, Ctrl-Shift-clicking on the render layer to create the viewer node, and then opening the viewer node in the image editor. This is our basic setup for post-processing. Now, instead of using the render layers, as if we have just rendered something, let's actually load our 8-bit image via the image node. So here we have two of these guys, the PNG and the EXR. Let's start with the PNG one. So I'm connecting its image output to the viewer. And you tell me, what did go wrong with the image? Can you see this dusty screen effect, like the image got flattened? That's because the Filmic View transform was applied twice technically. First, we baked the display transform right into an 8-bit image, a PNG in our case, and then we applied the display transform for the second time in this new Blender scene, hence the weird flattening of the contrast. On top of that, we have lost all the wide dynamic range on saving in the PNG format. Now the litmus test, the reduction of the exposure. Remember, we had the area of the higher intensities that spanned across the wide dynamic range and went all the way to 35 and above. Yeah, forget about it, it was clipped to 1 on saving the PNG file. It was clipped to display. Sadly for us 3D lighting artists, the scene-referred lighting data is no more. We technically can do nothing about it. And to make it even more sad, it will definitely affect our post-processing options as well. Let's demonstrate it by throwing in the glare node. The way the glare effect works in Blender is that it detects the very hot scene-referred pixels with the intensities of 5, 10, 15, you name it, and then it blooms these higher intensity pixels. There are no more such pixels there, they were all trashed, so there is no more glare, as simple as that. Thankfully, we have also saved the 32-bit OpenEXR with the unbounded light values, the scene-referred values, which is important. So let's see how it behaves instead. Let us switch our image to the EXR. And obviously the first thing everyone gonna do is sample the bright pixels. And woo, we've got our high intensities back. Hello brightness, my old friend. It's good to see them back. You can sample any bright area to just double check if everything is alright. So that is the result that corresponds 100% to the Blender render that we made in the previous tutorial. That is the wide range of lighting values intact. We can prove it by our exposure litmus test. The super bright bunch of pixels generated by the lens flare, it is still there. Now, technically, this 32-bit image file should hold all the intensities we need for post-processing the full image data intact. And so we can go to building our universal post-processing chain. But first, for the sake of completing our little experiment, let's drop in the glare node. Back into Compositor, Shift-A, Filter, Glare. Now it should absolutely catch those outstanding scene-referred RGB pixels that go above the threshold of 1 in terms of their intensity. And so that is the major difference between saving the image before post-processing it in the 8-bit format, such as PNG, JPEG or TIFF, or utilizing one of the scene-referred formats, such as OpenEXR, which is 32-bit by default. The scene-referred image formats were created for the computer graphics work, for storing the light values required for post-processing, so that naturally should be our choice. And incidentally, to double down on this point, when we hit F12 to render stuff out in Blender, we render it internally precisely in the 32-bit scene-referred format. Just to clarify things. Here I want to pause really quickly and talk about the alternative backdrop preview options. Some people like to preview the Blender Compositor output not in the separate window, such as the image editor at the bottom of the screen, but right within the Blender Compositor one. In order to see our stuff right there, we just need to check the backdrop button at the top of the UI. Then this little preview can be resized with help of the V or Alt-V shortcuts, or panned around while holding Alt and using the middle mouse button. What we see in the backdrop is actually the output of the viewer node, so if you don't see anything, you just need to add the viewer first. If it feels more convenient for you to preview the compositing chain right in this viewport, I respect your choice, obviously. Don't forget about the viewer though. My personal preference is quite fluid and depends on my mood and on the project, fluctuates quite a bit, but I think my current vibe would dictate me to use the image editor instead. Now technically nothing prevents us from jumping straight into building the post-processing chain. Arguably, the first thing that comes to mind when talking about post-processing and lighting effects is glare. Glare or blooming is the optical effect where light from bright source appears to leak into surrounding objects. By default, the Blender Glare node takes the bright glints that go above the threshold of 1 and adds these little streaks. By the way, you can press M to mute the node temporarily and M to bring it back. So the core of the effect is just to detect the brightest pixels falling outside a certain threshold, and then you can add the fog glow to them, for example. To work in a physically plausible manner, it totally depends on the scene-referred data, the type of data Blender uses by default for its calculations when I hit the render button, or otherwise, to preserve the dynamic range, as we have mentioned, you have to use the OpenEXR format or any other 32-bit unbounded scene-referred format. In addition to glare, we can try to simulate different types of photographic blooming effects, for example, simulating diffusion filters. These type of filters, or in some cases dabbing Vaseline directly onto the lens, is used to create a hazy, dreamy glow. We won't keep it in our main setup, but let's have a look at this effect, just for the sake of off-topic. If you feel like borrowing this effect from photography, and cinematography for that matter, we can go with the mix filter. God, what I'm saying, it's not filter, it's mix node. And then we add the blur filter, which expects our image as an input. So we should probably plug the glare output there. So far we don't see anything spectacular, and that is because we need to connect it to the second socket of the mix node. Then what I usually do is strike the relative checkbox to make it non-dependent on the scene resolution, and then up the X and Y blur values. To be fair, to make it look uniform, we should also play with the aspect correction. I will check the Y aspect correction. As for the amount of blurriness, I want it to be fairly dreamy and hazy, but still retain some bigger shapes, if that makes sense. Now to make it shine, the mix factor should be switched over to add. The add mode is one of the safest blending modes when working with the scene-referred light data. Add, multiply, what else? Mix. Pretty much everything else is broken when working with the unbounded light values. Alright, but now we have to compensate the exposure, and we can do it, of course, with the help of the exposure node, or just by using good old RGB curves. Trying to eyeball, or rather approximate the brightness. Okay, now it should be possible to compare before and after by muting these two nodes and toggling them back on. Alright, it is dreamy, it is hazy, it is 90s as hell, probably not my type of effect, not always at least. And still it has its place in very small doses, to unify the light values ever so slightly across the image. Something like that. Anyway, so that is another filter from photography that we can try to simulate using compositor nodes. But meanwhile, let's get rid of our soft diffusion setup and take a step back. So once upon the compositor, there was a glare node. Let's start from here. Now moving on to copying some other mistakes of photographic image formation, such as chromatic aberration within the lens. And it's also known as color fringing, and it produces the colorful outlines around the edges of the objects. It can be an unwanted or highly desirable effect, depending on your style, but if we talk about CG lighting, it's fairly important to know how to pepper your image up with such mistakes. In Blender, the easiest way to achieve chromatic aberration is to use the lens distortion node and then crank up the dispersion value. It just blew the picture up into this kind of colorful mess, which proves that every effect should be used in moderation. And when we set the mode to projector, it is much more bearable, much more palatable. The amount of dispersion or chromatic aberration is a matter of personal preference, but I like it in both CG and in photography for that matter. There is something very attractive in the idea of the different wavelengths of light splitting inside the lens to produce this effect. It kind of reveals the inner working of light that passes through the lens, which shows that the lens is a very complex object indeed. There is a certain, how should I put it, image formation depth about it, and some people dare say that it looks good. Okay, following the theme of the optical aberrations that should degrade the image but actually make it look better, here is another one, the vignette effect. That is often associated with the retro lenses. The vignette effect is all about darkening the edges of the image, as simple as that, and we can do it procedurally in Blender Compositor. I'm gonna go Matte and add the ellipse mask. The mask should go into the mix factor of our newly created mix node. There should be this type of white ellipse right in the center of the screen. We need to scale its width and height, so it's approximately touching the edges, like that. So the width of 1 and the height of 0.4 something gets the job done. Now it has to be inverted, so the mix node affects the edges of the image only. And obviously if we are aiming to get the darkening effect, the color should be made darker there. As for the blending mode, I have just said that everything aside multiply, add and mix is a blunder, and here I myself set the mix mode to soft light, but okay, fair enough. The blur node can be used to gradually soften the edges of the mask, and the intensity of the effect is basically controlled by altering the shade of gray. Can't stop thinking about the blending mode, we should change it. And true, multiply is way safer. Add, multiply and mix just doesn't screw the colors. These operations are perfectly linear, perfectly safe for the scene-referred linear type of data. Alright, cool. So that was the darkening around the edges effect, aka the retro vignetting effect. It's classic, it's timeless and elegant and very easy to do. That is why it's always welcome to our cinematic post-processing effects party. The next set of controls for our cinematic post-processing chain will be related to tweaking the color. The first one is going to be temperature, a major part of calibrating the white balance. Based on the temperature slider, the overall color of lighting can be made warmer or cooler, so let's start with adding the mix node, choosing multiply as the blend mode, and then we simply balance the overall temperature of lighting by moving it over to the orange or the blue parts of the color wheel. The mix factor can also be used to fine-tune the grading. The change to the color temperature is a sweeping change to all the color relationships in your lighting. It's this type of much-needed extra control over your lighting scheme that just changes the overall relationship between colors in your lighting and allows you to push it towards warmer or cooler tones. Aside from the temperature control, the photographic post-processing tools often include the tint control as well. The tint slider usually goes from green to magenta to cover that portion of the color gamut, so the mix node is invited to stage once again. If you know me, I like to rename the nodes and everything to keep things organized, so that one should be named tint from now on. As we have mentioned, you either choose green or a complementary color to green, which is magenta, and the rest of the game is just eyeballing the intensity of the tinting effect. So the combo of temperature and tint nodes is our way of controlling white balance in Blender Compositor, and think of it as a rather global adjustment as opposed to tweaking the individual lights and trying to balance them against each other. Tweaking these two nodes alone may alter the perception of the entire lighting that we have set up. As they say, borrow from cinematographers. The value contrast, or the contrast of brightnesses, plays an important role in color grading. There are a few places in Blender where you can adjust the contrast. In the Blender Compositor we have the brightness contrast node, but I prefer the other methods, as I think that by using this node in the compositor it's fairly easy to clip the blacks, for example, so I don't feel really comfortable with it for some reason. The RGB curves node is much better in that sense. A common way to ramp up the value contrast there is to draw the so-called S-shaped curve, and then you can play with the position of these points to pivot the contrast. Again, M mutes and unmutes the node, and can be used to compare before and after. So that is yet another way of controlling the contrast. We also have the color management tab where such things can be controlled, so let's have a look at it. In the filmic look drop-down of the color management tab, there are a few contrast-based looks to choose from. The default one is puzzlingly named None, but actually that's the same thing as the medium contrast one. And then we can climb up and down the contrast ladder by going high contrast, very high contrast, super duper high contrast, and so on. Needless to say, the base contrast look plays an important, probably pivotal role in the image formation, so it cannot be overlooked. It is also worth mentioning that the adjustments that we do in the color management tab are applied after the post-processing chain. Basically, they are applied on display transform, the last step in the rendering pipeline. And of course we also have the RGB curves there. The difference between this tab and the RGB curves in the Blender Compositor is that the RGB curves from the color management tab are applied the last, as we have just said. As a neat bonus, it doesn't have to be rendered, it is applied in real time. That's why I love adjusting contrast, and for that matter adjusting the RGB base curves look right from this menu, without even going into post-processing. Well, at least as a look and feel preview, I love doing that. It is especially attractive, in my opinion, for mocking up a specific look by curving the red, green and blue channels individually. For example, we can take away some greens from the shadowy areas of the image and boost some greens in the highlights instead. Better to stay away from the acidic adjustments and just keep it subtle. And going along the same line, maybe the shadows could benefit from less blue, which would then go into highlights. So something like that anyway. I usually use it as a way of quickly previewing the look I'm aiming for, before even touching the post-pro nodes. I tend to think about such curving of digital red, green and blue channels as trying to emulate the color idiosyncrasies of film. As we know, the color layers of film were designed in such way to display a very non-linear, interesting behavior depending on the part of the wavelength that hit the film. So it's fairly interesting to think of it in such way as to emulate a specific film look, let's say. Actually, thinking of it, maybe we should make a separate video on film emulation at some point. That's such an interesting subject. Not to take away the importance of a proper color balance via the color balance node in the Blender Compositor though. Let's make some room. And Shift A then, and add the color balance node. Because the lift gamma gain mode is slightly problematic for the reasons we won't go into, the offset power slope node is the way to go. The three sliders offset, power and slope allow you to affect the hue in the given tonal range. The offset affects the shadows the strongest, the power affects the mid-tones, while the slope affects the highlights the strongest. The grayscale slider in each of the bands is yet another way of adjusting the contrast. So here, for example, I boosted the contrast ever so slightly, and now I'm about to shift the hue of the mid-tones to certain color. I'm thinking about creating the complementary contrast between the warmer mid-tones and the cooler highlights. That's a typical trick of enriching the lighting by splitting the mid-tones and the highlights in terms of color temperature. Here you can see me adding some punch to the highlights. And by the way, if you click the color, the value can be set higher than 2 for a more pronounced effect. That doesn't mean that we have to set it higher than 2, but we can. It could be a good idea to cool down the highlights to create the complementary contrast by pushing this slope color wheel into the cyan areas. And yeah, in my opinion, that could work. That could actually work. So that is our color balance node in the Blender Compositor with offset, power and slope controls. Too bad it almost never boils down to a singular node. We have built a fairly elaborate post-processing chain already, and the effect of every new node ripples through this chain. So more often than not, after, for example, tweaking the color balance, we may discover that we now have to adjust the temperature and the tint and maybe something else. It becomes even more, I wanted to say confusing, but let's say interesting and complex if we add the color management into equation. As you remember, we have curved the red, green and blue channels of the filmic display transforms, so we can use that as well on top of everything else to add a little bit of sophistication. By now I realized out of a sudden that I have probably swept the colors a little bit too far away from our original intention, so I brought some warmth back. So these are our basic color grading options pretty much. We have one more to go, which is saturation though. Saturation refers to how colorful the color is, and when dealing with lighting, the effect of chromaticity on the overall impression is not to be underestimated, obviously. Taking a step back, the better place to plug our saturation node would be just before the color balance. Then we can make the whole colorfulness of the light sources more dim or more pronounced on the contrary if you would like to. The higher saturation values though can look pretty funky. It's better to keep the effect subtle, just like any other effect within the Blender Compositor, to be honest. To be on the safer side and not to clip the individual color channels and stuff like that, sometimes it's more convenient to tweak the light colors instead of tweaking the saturation slider. So for now, I'm gonna M to mute our newly added saturation node. It would be impossible not to mention film grain among other effects of our cinematic post-processing chain. The visible silver crystals in the film negative's emulsion add something very important to the filmic vibe, so let's try to recreate it. A quick note, we'll use a fairly simplistic method for adding grain, only suitable for static renders, even though there are ways to make animated noise in Blender Compositor. Alright. We would need the image node with the film grain texture loaded in. You can find one in the project files. If you hold Ctrl-Shift and click on this node, you will notice that I cheated a little bit and this texture resembles a digital noise rather than a film grain, but it will work just as well for our purposes. So let's connect it to the second socket of the newly created mix node, set the blending mode to overlay. It led to some rather weird darkening of the image, and that's because this texture was designed to be used with the linear color space. So that is important to keep in mind, the color spaces of any texture, whether it should be sRGB or linear. And then basically what we need to do is mix in a teensy bit of that noise, a homeopathic dose really. It could be pretty hard to see. I hope you're able to notice it through the video compression. Let me zoom it in for you. Our digital noise texture imposed over the image helps to break up a perfect digital look, the straightness of lines. It kind of brings all elements together by throwing in a layer of entropy on top of it and diluting the digital look, just like we have said. So that is our film grain, even though it's not necessarily filmic in this particular case. It is also worth mentioning that the size of the noise can be changed with the help of this scale node. And I also wanted to mention that we have included some real film grain textures in the project files, like the real deal, so have a look. That being said, a tiny amount of a good old random noise or purling noise gets the job done in this case. And that is usually one of the finishing touches that I add to the post-processing pipeline that helps to soften the digital look, even though it's a digital noise. That's paradoxical. Next, we'll have a look at the output blanking, aka changing the aspect ratio visually, and then we recap the steps that we have taken. In the realm of cinematic post-processing, changing the aspect ratio to something widescreen is an easy win. I know it could sound weird, but adding the black bars to the top and bottom of the image, or so-called letterboxing the image, could make it look slightly more cinematic right out of the box. Or let's put it like this, it could be a useful way to explore different possibilities related to changing the aspect ratio. So let's set up a box mask, set the width to 1 and the height to something that represents our letterbox. A quick disclaimer, it won't be terribly useful in the case of this image because it was already widescreen right off the start, but other than that it could be very handy to know. So the box mask goes into the invert node, and that goes into the mix factor of our aspect ratio mix node. Then the height parameter in the box mask could be used to calibrate the output blanking. To avoid any confusion, the output blanking is meant for preview. The aspect ratio of the final render should be defined in the output tab via adjusting the resolution. And of course, we should also mention that there is no direct link between some aspect ratio and how cinematic it looks in the end. So when I say that the widescreen aspect ratio is somehow cinematic, I'm obviously being ironic, even though it's true to some extent. There are some historical connotations of certain aspect ratios like anamorphic format or 4:3 that was adopted more than 100 years ago originally. But anyway, I think it is still very useful to be able to control the aspect ratio like that in the Blender Compositor, so here we go. After we've done the post-pro work, how should we save the final image? Now we stand on the crossroad. We can use either 8-bit display referred format or 32-bit scene referred one. Look, because we have done everything we wanted to do with our high dynamic range light data, now we can just bake it into the 8-bit display referred file and just view it as an image. It makes perfect sense if the image that we are about to export is the final stop, the final destination, an image on ArtStation, for example, and you won't do any extra post-processing work on it. Then there is nothing wrong with fixating the display encoding within the image. But if you still want to retain the wide dynamic range of colors, such as the intensities in this hotspot that now go well above the 100 in the red channel, then the OpenEXR, the 32-bit image format, would be the natural choice, as we have already proved. It makes sense if the image that you are about to save will be used as an intermediary image, holding some important data for further post-processing, let's say, or for exchange with a different software for that matter. Generally, OpenEXR is such a great format for pretty much anything related to computer graphics, and it has such a miraculous compression as well. When used in conjunction with the half precision of the floating point, the resulting EXRs are super lightweight, much more lightweight than 8-bit PNGs, for example. But that is off topic, my friends. Let's get back on track. Okay, so we have used quite a lot of nodes to build a cinematic post-processing pipeline in Blender. The next logical step would be to pack it into some kind of a group that could be exported in between the Blender files. So I'm drawing the rectangle around all the nodes we created in the compositor. then right-click, group. That puts the whole chain into the group, and we can see that we are within the group right now. We can press Tab to get out of it. Tab is our stop word when dealing with groups, otherwise we can get stuck in there. I'm calling it postpro_01, and actually we can mute and unmute the whole group, which is very convenient. And if you want to change something, you press Tab again and find what you need, tweak what you need, Tab to get out. That was a quick introduction to grouping nodes in Blender. Now this node group should be easily exportable via the append functionality of Blender, which we will show in just a moment, after I neaten up the nodes for no particular reason. Here I opened a random Blender file to show the process of appending the node group. You go File, Append, search for where you have put the blend file, for example this one, double click on it, then go down the node tree folder, and here we go. Double click again. Now Shift A, and it should be visible in the group menu. And just plug it in. Obviously, when it comes to PostPro, one size doesn't fit all, but this whole configuration of nodes will be as useful as it was in the previous scene. What we'll need to do is just go through every individual node and tweak it to our taste. I really hope that this post-processing formula will help you to bring out the best cinematic qualities of your lighting formula, and they will work together. My name is Gleb Alexandrov. You're still watching the Cinematic Lighting in 3D video course. Now let's do a quick recap of this section. A proper post-processing chain is crucial for getting most out of your lighting setup. In this tutorial we have built a fairly versatile set of controls and enhancements in Blender Compositor, so we have tools we need for basic creative post-production. We have started with a 32-bit scene-referred representation of the original scene. Then we made the brightest parts glow with the help of the glare node. Next, we indulged in adding the lens distortion effect, which simulates chromatic aberration, and we carried on adding photographic adjustments with the help of vignette. The next section introduced temperature and tint as a part of the white balance controls, and also color balance to fine-tune our grading. The final touch was to simulate the graininess of film, which turned out to be digital. And then we took one more look at the color management options like RGB curves, filmic contrast, and exposure. Subjectively, I would certainly go one step further and give it the exposure boost for that shimmering light quality, but that's just one option from many. To waste no time, next time, recreating the whole cinematic post-processing chain, we packed everything into a group that can be easily moved between the blend files. Thank you again for watching. The next chapter will provide even a deeper look into cinematic lighting techniques. I'm sure you will love it. Feel free to ask any questions on our Discord, on Twitter, everywhere, via email. Your feedback and questions are always appreciated. Take care and see you in the next one. As a quick reminder, if you're watching Cinematic Lighting offline, just remember that you can find this course with all the recent updates and more tutorials like that on Blender Market, Gumroad, or our website creativeshrimp.com. My name is Gleb Alexandrov. I can be found online as well, on social media. I love coffee, and together we're changing the world of computer graphics. Thank you again for watching, and I think we can transition to the next video now. And I'm transitioning to my next coffee cup, I guess.